welcome to the Art of Being Human. I'm going to start off this show with another story. Last time we had a segment, I talked about this man who developed a hoarding problem because he didn't have a way to express or get help with the fear that he felt when a student threatened his life. Well, and this is a little bit different story, but it's for a man that needed help, and he didn't get it either. He thought he was under suspicion. He thought the police were looking for him, so he hid. So I want to tell you this story, but it is a story of not giving place to our fear, of having fear and letting the fear disrupt our lives, and then finally, of course, overcoming that. So at any rate, this is a story about a man who had some friends, and I guess some of his friends were involved in some illegal activities, and there were some arrests made. Well, he became convinced that the police were looking for him too, and he didn't want to go to jail, and he went ahead and he hid. He hid in a farm or in a barn that one of his friends owned, or one of his family members, I guess, owned. And they made a place for him within this barn so he could live in it. He never went outside the barn. They provided him with all the food that he needed, all of the water, all of the drinks, and whatever he needed, they made sure he had it. And so therefore, he could live there. But he never had any social engagements. He never went out with his friends. He never had dinner out. He never went shopping. He never took walks. Nothing that we normal people do all the time. And he was so terrified that he was going to be found out and the police were going to find him, that he never left the barn. You know, that he wouldn't take a walk and maybe a plane would be overhead, or maybe the police would be hovering around with cameras and they would catch him outside of the barn, so therefore they would know he was there and he'd be arrested. If you'd asked him what he was going to be arrested for, he wasn't sure, but he was sure, since some of his friends were arrested, that he was going to be arrested too, and he didn't want to go to jail, so he hid. And his fear came and locked him up, in a sense. He never had a normal life. And how long did he hide? He hid for over 30 years. I think I figured it out, a good 32, 33 years. He was in a barn, living in a barn, without any access to normal human activities for at least 32 years of his life. Supposing that he lived to be 90 years old, well, that's a third of his life that was gone. Now, through a series of circumstances, I don't know what they were, he discovered that the police were not out to get him. He was not considered a criminal. They weren't hunting for him. They weren't looking for him at all. As far as they were concerned, he should be a free man. So all of those 32, 33 years, whichever it was in the 30s somewhere, he cut himself off from normal activities of a human being and had no social relationships, no deep, enduring social relationships, except the people, of course, in his family that came to make sure he was all right. And there he was, 30 years in hiding from someone that wasn't looking for him, from the police that weren't even looking for him. He was a free man, but he wasted those 30 years. Now, I would have thought, if he'd seen a therapist, well, what did you do? And if I had been a therapist and I was seeing him, I would have contacted somebody, with his permission, of course, and without using any of his names or his circumstances, but was this person under arrest? Was he supposed to be under arrest? Did what he do, or what he thought he did, was important enough that a law enforcement agency would be looking for them? And it obviously wasn't. They didn't care. They didn't know he was hiding in a barn for 30 years. They weren't hunting for him to begin with. He was not a criminal. So you can see that now, after, of course, he discovered this, he gradually got rid of the living in the barn and rejoined society again. But think about how much was lost. Think about how much is lost if you have a problem and you don't tend to it when you need to tend to it. It's just kind of a cautionary tale. So what about people who have a problem with fear. What about people who have post-traumatic stress disorder? This is a disorder that I'm going to be discussing this segment. What actually is it? Now, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a person can be frightfully just really in terms of a magnitude of fear over something that happened that they saw, something that happened to them, and it developed in them a very, very strange stress and lots of panic, lots of anxiety. So what people think of PTSD, if you were to ask the person on the street, what does PTSD mean to you? What they're going to say probably is that a person has had a bad experience and they've been unable to move on. And that's partially true. They can have a traumatic event that either they experienced once or it may be repeated, as it might be in a case of abuse, and they're unable to move on from that, and they're paralyzed by that. But what would their symptoms be? If you talk to a person who has PTSD, this is what they would say. Well, they have unwanted memories, negative memories. They're hypervigilant. Hypervigilant means you're always on guard to see that everything's all right, to see that you are safe. You're constantly watching. Your eyes are darting about. You got to make sure it's all right. I had a friend of mine, I used to go shopping with her, and she used to use an ATM machine. Well, it was quite a thing to watch her use the ATM machine. I would step out of the way because she's looking around to see if anyone's around that could see her use it. Could anyone see her numbers? And she's like hypervigilant. She's watching for every little thing. Why? Because somebody might catch her. Somebody might steal a number. Somebody might get a hold of her money because they can watch her in some kind of way. I mean, it was to the point where it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me that she behaved that way, because no one's standing close to you or that close to you when you're using a machine like that. And what you would be better off if you just went to the bank and withdrew some money and not use the ATM at all and not be so fearful. But that's what hypervigilance means. Then there would be the emotional distress and a sense of threat. Intrusive thoughts, which is what causes the OCD to begin with, avoidance and isolation and memory problems, anger, guilt, shame for what a person supposedly did or what they saw happen. You can be ashamed and guilty over things that you have no control over, and it's not your fault, but that happens in this condition. Depression, blame, dissociation. Dissociation is interesting, but it's like you kind of phase out of a picture and you're thinking about something else or doing something else. It's almost like the imagination takes wings and you're living in an imaginary world. It's like if you're driving and you're thinking about something else, so you miss your turn off, and you have to go back and get to the turn off again. You were in another space at the time that you were supposed to be taking that turn off, thinking about something else. You're like in a different mode, and that's what dissociation is. Now, it has different degrees to it. Some people do use dissociation. Some people use it to the point where they're almost not there because they're somewhere else most of the time. And so that can become problematic, and that has to be helped. But a lot of people have some dissociation where they're going to drive along and they miss their stop, or they're thinking about something else, so they take a wrong turn and they have to retrace their steps. That type of dissociation is not that uncommon. But if you're at the point where you're really not even focused upon what's reality and you're only focused on something else, well, then that becomes a problem. They're easily scared. They have flashbacks, nightmares, sleep problems, and self-destructive behavior. All of those symptoms can be a part of the problem if you have PTSD, post-traumatic stress. Now, post-traumatic stress is trauma and abuse, either seen or experienced, either one time or many times or several times. It can become complicated, such as with abuse, where it can continue. Supposing you're a person who was 10 years old and you were abused, and it lasted till you were 14 or 15. At that point where you were abused, your growth and your development stopped, and emotionally, that's where you are at that level. It didn't continue. You didn't make further steps toward emotional maturity because you were stuck in that place where you were first abused. And if it was a process that happened over and over and over again, it would be very, very difficult to get out of that into normal behavior, because it's like you're stuck. You're stuck right there. This is where therapy becomes important, because you can get out of that. Whatever you're in that you're stuck in, first of all, you might not remember the abuse completely. You might not even know that you're stuck. But you know something's wrong, because you know something's different. You can't seem to keep up with other people. You can't seem to have normal relations with other people. And you just know that somewhere something's gone on. You might not remember all of it. You might only remember part of it. It is healable, but if a person needs that kind of attention to get them out of it, if they need the kind of care, then they should get that kind of care so they can rejoin the human race and be a normal person. So this is the kinds of things that a person will get post-traumatic stress from: combat, rape, assault, seeing somebody die, abusing or having been abused, either seen or experienced, life-threatening illnesses, chronic illnesses, an accident, dysfunctional family members. They could cause it as well, where there's abuse, drugs, or alcoholism, severe pain, loss, natural disaster. Now, we're in a pandemic in which a lot of people have lost a lot of people. A lot of people have died. A lot of people have become seriously ill. A lot of people have had to become caregivers of people who are seriously ill, hoping not to get it themselves. It's been a bad situation, but I suspect that a lot of these people will end up with post-traumatic stress. I believe a lot of these people are going to be OCD, obsessive compulsive, which is what I covered on the last session. I don't want to repeat that again, but see, some of these symptoms fit in with both. So stress can happen to anyone. Post-traumatic stress is severe. It's severe, and you can't really get rid of it very well, because when you think of it and think about the things that are causing it, your brain takes action. Your brain actually remembers not only the events that have been painful, but the emotions that have gone with them. And when you activate that, you relive those emotions just like you did at the time that it happened, or you may be still going through the process. I call it living through your past pain. That's not the scientific word for it, but it fits. You live through your past pain. You've been abused, you lost a job, your house was taken, who knows what happened. Lots of things happened. To you, it was abusive, and you can't seem to make the break forward to get rid of that and to start anew. And that's what happens in PTSD, and to a certain degree also in all of the other disorders that I'm discussing here and there. You know, obsessive compulsive is the same way. And so what you have to do to get rid of that, you have to have help and healing, because this may be too deep for you to try to do it on your own. But the key is try to think of something and distract yourself so that your mind isn't always filled with the thoughts of the things that happen. When you start to get abused, or when you are emotionally traumatized, it's hard to think of anything else. It's hard to think of anything else. If you can develop a way of taking your thoughts and separating them and saying, no, I'm not going to think about this, and if you are successful in thinking about something else, even for a few minutes, that's going to take your mind off that stress and your stress level is going to come down. But you know, if you're seriously stressed and you have problems because of past abuse, you can't probably do it on your own. You need to seek out help with that. But you know, you can get help with that, and it is healable. People who feel guilty oftentimes feel guilty about things that they're not responsible for. It's not their fault. Children especially, it's not your fault if your parents get a divorce. No matter what the situation was, you did not cause that divorce. No parent can blame a child for their problems. What a parent needs to do is face their problems so that they can be a help to their child, because if they're going through problems, the child is also going through it. So you need to remember those things. Those things will cause all kinds of PTSD, post-traumatic stress, and it's something that's very hard to get rid of. So for the symptoms, and I'm just going to summarize this: flashbacks, nightmares, emotional numbing. That is, you can't get excited about anything, and you just kind of, life is life, and that's it. You know, there's no emotionality. Poor social relationships, vulnerability, alienation, anxiety, anger, guilt, and dissociation. So trauma is a lasting psychological disturbance and is due to a major traumatic event. So if I can define this, and I'll do this once again, what is trauma? And what is PTSD? It's a lasting psychological disturbance. In other words, it just is there and it keeps being there. But it's due to a major traumatic event that you've been through, either recently or in your past, either remembered or not remembered. Now, trauma can happen to anyone. And I'm just going to give you some facts here, just so you see how common that it really is. 1 in every 5 Americans have been molested as a child. 1 in every 5. 1 in every 4 was beaten by a parent. 1 in every 4 people beaten by a parent. 1 in every 3 couples are violent with each other. Think of what a child goes through when they see their parents fighting. And you know, all the time they're taking the blame for that. It's my fault. If I was a better kid, my parents wouldn't fight. That's absolutely not true, but that's what children believe. And I think the reason that they believe that, as I've thought this out, that adults are the big people. The adults are the ones that are supposed to have it all together. They're not supposed to be anything that they can't handle. We look up to the adults. They know what to do when things happen. They know how to take care of us when we're sick. So if something goes wrong in that, the child's perception of the adult, if something goes wrong with that, then what's going to happen is the child is going to blame themselves, even though they are not at all to blame. So if you are blaming yourself about your parents' abuse, about how you were treated, about how you were abused yourself, it is not your fault. You did not do anything wrong. You should not be blaming yourself. And I don't know how many teenagers I've told that to, who had a problem growing up, whose parents had problems, and they're blaming themselves. And I will say to them over and over and over again, don't take the blame. It wasn't your fault. A child cannot be held responsible for what happens to an adult. The adults are the ones that are supposed to be able to take care of themselves. Now, usually, they don't try to blame the child, but since the child is busy blaming themselves, they don't even have to. Somehow the child is heaping on blame on themselves. Well, my parents are divorced. It must be my fault. I was giving a talk to a group of preteen girls in a church setting. And the pastor was really good. He's an elderly man, and he wanted me to help him with this thing. So we put on this thing like a question and answer thing. And the children would make up questions, and then we would answer the questions. Either he would answer it or I would answer it. And so therefore, one child wrote, "My parents are going to get a divorce. Do I have a right to be angry about that?" She was unsure. And the pastor answered it and he did a beautiful job. He says, "You're darn tootin', you've got a right to be mad. We created you, and by golly, we owe you something. We owe you a good life." And so that took the fear away from the child, who was having an emotional problem about her parents breaking up. As well, she should have an emotional problem, but she shouldn't be taking any blame for it. They should be helping her to get through it, but she should not be taking any blame. So whatever happened in your background that affected you, you're not necessarily at fault, and you shouldn't blame yourself, because it had nothing to do with you. It had to do with problems with your parents or with where you were living or anything else. Do not blame yourself for things that happened to you in the past. Now, I'm not saying that kids don't do things wrong sometimes, but to blame themselves for a marriage in trouble or to blame themselves for abuse, they should never do that. And as adults, we still do it. Well, it's my fault, I shouldn't have done this. It's my fault, I should have been a better kid. Children are children. They can't bear adult responsibilities. Their brain doesn't even develop fully until at least age 25. And so when you're 10 and 11 and you're trying to do adult responsibilities at age 11 or 12, and you're not going to even be a human being fully developed in terms of your brain power until 25, it's just not a fair way to treat yourself. So I just want to make this known to you. 1 in every 3 couples are violent with each other, and a quarter of people growing up had alcoholic relatives or alcoholic parents. 1 out of 8 saw their mother being hit, and the trauma affects not only those who have experienced it or seen it, but also to the family members around them. So the trauma becomes unbearable, and it becomes intolerable, and we try to push things out of our minds when we're in that kind of situation, and we try to live normally, but the memories haunt us. So we have feelings and fears of the trauma. As one person said it, and I mentioned it in the last segment, I fear the terrors of the night. So it's time for the fears to go away. It's time to get help with them. So I'm not doing therapy over the television screen, but I can point you in the right direction and help you to unburden yourself of things you don't have to be burdened with. But as for therapy, you need to go to a therapist who can help you with the things that I'm talking about and give you a freedom that maybe you have never known before. So I'm going to close it here, and we're going to continue on this next time. So please join me then.